I'm Tim Walker, the Executive Director of the Metro Historical Commission. I'd like to welcome you to TSU's Avon William campus for the 32nd Annual African American History and Culture Conference. It's really great to see a big crowd here this morning. We have more than 250 attendees here this morning, which ties our record-breaking attendance from last year, so we really appreciate it. And a little later this morning, we're going to be joined by 65 middle school students from John Early Museum Magnet School, a school that focuses on history, so I hope you'll welcome them. The Metro Historical Commission has been honored to be a co-sponsor of this event with Tennessee State University since its creation in 1981. I know you're going to be inspired by today's lectures and music performance, which cover diverse history and contributions of African Americans in Middle Tennessee and Nashville. Before we get started, I want to recognize and thank the conference's planning committee, and if you'd please stand when I call your name. First, longtime co-chairs of the event, Dr. Revis Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell. And Linda Wynn. And committee members, Yildiz Brinkley, Pamela Bobo, Crystal DeGregory. Don't see Crystal, but I know she'll be here later. Gloria Johnson. Michael McBride. I haven't seen Michael yet this morning, but he'll be here. Gloria McKissick. Tara Melnick. In the very back there, Sharon Hall-Smith. And Lee Williams. I also want to recognize members of the Metro Historical Commission and Dr. Carol Busey, the Davidson County historian. Would you please stand? And finally, I'd like to thank the MHC staff persons that are working the registration desk in the lobby, Scarlett Miles and Avon Ogren, and the TSU staff member, Cordia McCutcheon. And before I introduce our next speaker, I've been asked to remind you that these blue evaluation forms, should have picked one of these up, and just remind you to fill those out. We really appreciate you doing that. Help us put on a better conference next year. But to finish this morning's welcome, I'd like to introduce Miss Linda Wynn. Many of you know Miss Wynn. She wears many, many hats. In addition to being a co-founder of the conference, she's a faculty member of the History Department at Fisk University, a noted writer and historian, Assistant Director of State Programs at the Tennessee Historical Commission, and I'm proud to say she serves on the Metro Historical Commission. Ms. Wynn.
Thank you, Tim. It is indeed good to be here this morning as we celebrate the 32nd anniversary or the 32nd annual Conference of African American Culture and History. I would like to thank all the members of the Metro Historical Commission who are here in support of the conference. Colleagues, thank you very much. As I was thinking about today, and 2013 in particular, it dawned on me that this is a year of numerous celebrations and commemorations, especially within the civil rights movement. This morning we will have a paper on the Emancipation Proclamation, which is the sesquicentennial or the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. Also, it is the 100th anniversary of Delta Sigma Theta Incorporated. It is also the 50th anniversary of, come on, Saras, that's fine. It is also the 50th anniversary of, let's see where we can start. In April of 1963, Students kicked off the Birmingham campaign against segregation with sit-ins at lunch counters in 1963. On April the 16th, Martin Luther King writes his letter from a Birmingham jail in which he outlined why blacks could no longer wait for justice. That letter soon became a book that he published later called Why We Can't Wait. In May, during protests in Alabama, Commissioner of Safety Bull Connor uses police dogs and fire hoses against black protesters, many of whom were children and teenagers. It was captured on tape. The footage went worldwide, and it became a major turning point in the modern civil rights movement. On June the 11th, in Alabama again, federal troops forced Governor George Wallace to allow students to enter the University of Alabama. Two of those students were Vivian Malone and James Hood. They entered after President Kennedy federalized the Alabama National Guard. On June the 12th, NAACP Field Director for Mississippi, Medgar Evers, who was only 37 at the time, was assassinated by Baron de la Beckwith. Who could forget August the 28th? That is when hundreds of thousands, both black and white, gathered at the Lincoln Memorial, where King delivered his 17-minute I Have a Dream speech, which has become one of the most famous speeches of the 20th century. I would be remiss if I did not mention Paula Murray, who strongly criticized the leadership of the civil rights movement for not including women at its planning of the March on Washington. And more than any other individual, it was Murray who deserves credit for expanding the language of civil rights beyond the struggle of African American freedom to equality for women, for women's rights, which she ultimately changed over to human rights. Paula Murray also coined the term Jane Crow. September 15th, on Sunday morning before service, the 16th Avenue Street Baptist Church was bombed, killing 4 young girls, and their names were Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robinson, Cynthia Wellesley, Denise McClare. In addition to the death of those 4 young girls, 22 others were injured. So you can see that 2013 is filled with a lot of remembrances that stretch from the Emancipation Proclamation all the way through to the modern civil rights movement. And I only mentioned a few of the things that were included in the year of 1963. And I mentioned them because you cannot separate the Emancipation Proclamation from the continuous civil rights movement. It is now my honor to introduce Dean Gloria Johnson. As she comes to the podium, please give her a round of applause.
Good morning. It's my pleasure as the interim dean of the College of Liberal Arts at Tennessee State University to welcome you to the university this morning to our conference. We are very proud to be a sponsor of this conference every year. I also would like to introduce to you our new president, Dr. Glenda Baskin Glover, the 8th president of Tennessee State University, and I would ask her to come forward with remarks at this time.
Good morning. It is a pleasure, such a rich privilege to be here today and to participate in this program. I'm so excited to be at Tennessee State right now and to participate in such a worthwhile program. If we talk about African American history and culture, and I'm proud of the role that Tennessee State has played in this history of the culture of African Americans, not just in Nashville and not just in Tennessee, but nationwide. And there's a saying that all politics is local, all history is local, and that's absolutely true. We first celebrate what we've done in our own era, what we've done in our own country, in our own city and state, and we're proud of that. And Tennessee State will continue to play its role in recognizing the history of African American culture, and we're proud to join in with the Metropolitan Historical Commission, as well as we recognize the Emancipation Proclamation also. I did talk Martin Luther King's birthday and went through all the history of where we came from and where we are now. And I see many of you who were there then, so I've decided not to repeat that today, because I don't want your mouths moving with me as I'm saying it. But at any rate, I thank you all for being here today and for having the wherewithal to put on such a conference and to continue it from prior years. I appreciate all that's going on, and we look forward to the role that Tennessee State will continue to play. Thank you.
Good morning. And again, welcome to this historical university, Tennessee State University, the former site of a contraband camp after the American Civil War here in Tennessee. Before I introduce this morning's first speaker, I'd like to pay homage to our financial supporters. As always, they have contributed for 32 years, those supporters being Akibulon Images, Spruce Street Baptist Church, Holy Trinity Episcopalian Church, the Tennessee Historical Commission, and TSU Friends of the Library. So if you would, please give those supporters a round of applause. I am very honored to introduce this morning's first speaker, Dr. Revis L. Mitchell, Jr. Revis is Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Fisk University. He is a native of Nashville, Tennessee, where he was educated not only in the public schools of Nashville, but also the Catholic schools. He obtained the Bachelor of Art degree from Fisk University. Advanced degrees include the Master of Science from Tennessee State, a doctorate from Middle Tennessee State University with postdoctoral studies at Harvard. Since 1980, Dr. Mitchell has been a member of the history faculty at Fisk University, where he is presently professor of history. During his tenure, he has held numerous administrative positions at Fisk, including Director of Institutional Advancement, Executive Assistant to the President, and Dean of Academic Affairs. Revis was one of the historians organizing this conference, Nashville's only and longest sustaining conference on African American history and culture. Over the past 20 years, he has written and published a number of profiles in the conference proceedings. And in today's packet, there's also a profile, I believe, on Aaron Douglas that Revis also published. Revis has served on the Metropolitan Historical Commission, and he chaired that commission in 2006 through 8. Presently, he serves as Vice President of the Tennessee Historical Commission. In 2012, the National Association of Social and Behavior Scientists presented its W.E.B. Du Bois Award to Revis L. Mitchell as one of America's leading scholars in the social sciences. Dr. Mitchell is a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, serving 2 terms as the national historian. Would you please welcome Dr. Revis Mitchell.
Good morning. Thank you for the kind introduction, Pam. That's the thing my secretary says when I'm trying to get a job. Right now, I'm not trying to get a job, but thank you all for sitting through that. It's an honor to address this group. Linda cited all of the anniversaries, and certainly one of them is Metropolitan Government's 50th anniversary. We were sitting around the planning committee meeting and trying to decide who was going to do the research on metropolitan government in Nashville and the black community. And it's a hard group. I said, I'll be happy to do some research on that. And they said, well, submit an abstract, and if we review it, you might get a chance. So I want to thank you all very much on the planning committee for giving me this chance to advance my career today. I hope this will help. I see President Glover down there. You know, I don't know if you're looking for any young historians out on the campus, but it's a fascinating topic when you look at the questions of politics in Nashville, Tennessee, and the black community. Nashville's black community has always been political and always been politically involved. Visible power and organization has been a part of the future of Nashville. My colleague, award-winning historian Dr. Bobby Lovett, points out in his scholarly work, The Elites and Their Dilemmas, that blacks in Nashville understood the political system, even though it was set up to deny opportunity to blacks in Nashville. Were they Republican when it worked? Were they not Republican if they had to? Were they radical Republicans when they needed to? But this politics has always been a sense of black pride in Nashville, Tennessee. 2013, today we stand and we mark the 50th anniversary, a key year in Nashville's history, both in obvious and obscure ways. On May 1st, 1963, with great fanfare accompanied by official inaugural activities, Metropolitan Nashville's government gained much attention and was awarded many kudos around the world. But civil rights activists saw the year in different terms. We are sitting on a powder keg, noted one leading Nashville activist, and I believe it was Dr. C.T. Vivian. Such starkly different perspectives from the same year are important in considering Nashville's history and help to give shape and focus to this town once known as the Athens of the South, because so many educational institutions shared grounds with the Parthenons, seen as a center of enlightenment and opportunity, maybe the center, the capital of what we'd like to think of as the New South. There's little doubt that the battle to consolidate city and county services, however long-running and feverish, were important. It quieted political fractionalism, and it laid long-term groundwork for a city of prosperity, and was another reason to uphold the city, as many did and do, as a great place to work, start businesses, and raise families. But such a claim was necessary at the time. As Linda pointed out, if you look at Southern history, which is becoming United States history at the time, many Southern cities had to convince businesses and industry that the racial question would be managed sufficiently, that civic peace would not be disturbed. Only 3 years shortly before the celebrated 1960 lunch counter sit-ins had occurred in Nashville. This campaign was made virtually synonymous with the nonviolent direct action campaign, even though the settlement came only after the bombing of local attorney, civil rights icon, and American intellectual Z. Alexander Luby. His house had been bombed. There had been many pitched battles in the streets. Shortly thereafter, as Nashville's local movement began Operation Open City to further desegregate downtown, they found themselves thwarted by both token gestures in the boardroom and the menace of white thugs in the streets. By 1963, the cycle tearing movement activities, some began advocating within the black community, especially within college campus activities, more aggressive nonviolence, more direct interference with business and government operations to make their grievances heard. Others found themselves questioning nonviolent attempts and whether they would in fact touch white consciousness. at a student conference documented at Fisk University, papers available in its special collections area. Fisk students with colleagues from Tennessee State, the Harry, and several colleges outside of Nashville began to crystallize a sentiment. They began to put ideas together. History has later rewarded that as Black Power. The ideas began spraying like so many ideas from Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville's 1963 and 1964 demonstrations are less vivid in the city's public memory and forgotten by some historians, but marked a severe turbulence and turmoil across this city. And suddenly the question of civil rights and civil rights activities becomes Nashville rights and Nashville activities. And the conscience of Nashville had to be touched, and the whole world, via the afternoon news, was watching Nashville's response. Here, local events were put into a national context. By May of 1963, the specter of racial clashes had certainly loomed on the national agenda and media with activities in Birmingham, Alabama. Not only behind feverish demonstrations, but open violence. Who would speak out? What would be the response? What would be America's response to this violence? Also was behind the fears of whites desperate to avoid the stigma of hatred often associated with the Alabama activities. Ultimately, both factors helped to prod the formation of a Human Relations Committee as an important function of metropolitan government. Having a local government structure to help ensure equal racial opportunity was an important step in the formation of metropolitan government and seeing what it might become. And of course, these events nationally helped to set in motion a journey culminating in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, a crowning achievement of the movement. By yoking city and suburb more firmly together, had racial repercussions, even as the legal changes made it easy to conclude that integration was to be a foregone conclusion. As the shift to metropolitan government was accomplished, the shift was political and economic. It would require political and economic clout. It would reach from downtown to the suburbs. The ability to apply activist pressure was diffused. Rather than public accommodations, harder racial dilemmas such as employment, urban planning, urban renewal, schools, housing remained harder to dramatize and to confront. While Nashville's 1960 set-ins were a compelling and revealing chapter in the city's civil rights history, 1963 was equally pivotal and compelling in the activist change. They were increasingly undercut by legal actions, political shifts that altered the racial landscape in the coming years. Serving Black Nashvillians at a dinner was very different than involving them in the political and economic choices about their own neighborhoods. But the legacies are equally critical in understanding the evolution of Nashville's civil rights movement, which fought against racial bigotry, which helped to make Nashville what we wanted Nashville and hoped Nashville would be, and indeed set a pattern in America. Now, I'm going to take a point of personal privilege here. I can't tell history without looking at the stories. Who were the protagonists? Who were there? Who were the heroes? And certainly two names on both sides of the question would come to bear. The first was attorney Z. Alexander Luby, classically trained politician, classically trained educator, economist, and lawyer. Bachelor's from Howard University, a Bachelor of Law degree from Columbia University, and a Doctor of Juriscience from New York University. Luby stated that politics was a way to change an oppressive system. In 1963, Luby would become one of the members of the Metropolitan Charter Commission. Luby would be one of two blacks elected to the old city Nashville Council and would later serve on the Metropolitan Council for 20 years. In fact, he would later serve on that council. Luby, the hero lawyer who had defended the students, Luby, who my grandmother fondly referred to as Lawyer Luby, was a pivotal force in understanding that metropolitan form of government would enhance the lives of Nashville's African American community, both in the city and in the suburban area. that metropolitan government would ensure broader chances at public education, health issues, housing issues, sanitation issues. He knew that it would do it for the black community in Davidson County, and he also knew it would improve the opportunities within the city. The opposing view, and African Americans are never a unified, synonymous, homogeneous population. We are as different as our views are and where we come from and where we're headed. So I always get upset when people ask me, well, Revis, how does the black community feel about so-and-so? And I'll say, well, we met at 18th and D.B. Todd Saturday night. We feel as different as our backgrounds are. There were those, the other interesting light was Robert Bob Lillard. Bob Lillard I consider a grassroots politician and lawyer. Bob Lillard, who graduated from the Kent School of Law, organized by Z. Alexander Luby and other Nashville attorneys, who for many years was a Nashville firefighter. And he operated the fire engine out of famed engine company number 11 on Jefferson Street. Lillard understood that the political process would be expanded, but he feared that black political concentration and black political efforts would be lessened, that the numbers would be lessened. He had aspirations, as well he should, that Nashville would see greater black participation in political affairs. Even at that time, people were discussing the possibility of a black mayor in Nashville, Tennessee. And this was Lillard's activities. He was a politician. He was an excellent politician. He would serve on the old Nashville City Council and elected to the Metropolitan Council. In 1967, he becomes mayor pro tem by that council. I'd like to ask at this time, and I see one, but I'm going to ask the whole question. If there are any members of the Metropolitan Council, past or present, any members who served on the council present, will they please stand? Bob Lillard was right. African Americans do understand the political process. African Americans know how to go to the polls and bring the best from their neighborhood forward. It's my pleasure to introduce at this time State Senator Thelma Harper. Senator Harper, please stand. A marvelous example of a servant but a politician. Thelma Harper knows how to run a race. Thelma Harper's not a one community politician. She's not a one race politician. She's an elected official. She makes politics at its best. Nashville's black community has always understood politics. We've always been politically active. We always will be. Finally, this paper, and I know many of you, I hope, would have conversation and discussion. This paper, this attempt, is what this conference was set up to do. It's a local conference on African American history. We would hope, and at some point in time, hope to have conversation with some of you. We would hope that you'll find topics. I'm sure that there are many here who feel just as steeped as the person honored to stand here on this history. You lived it. You were a part of it. Write it down, discuss it. You got to tell your own story. Historian George Washington Williams said, for too long others have told our story. We must tell our own story. We must do it with pride and greatness. And from this conference, we hope that we get papers like that. We're going to put out a call from the conference. We're going to put out a call to the local colleges who professional historians might come and bring us topics. But I also want to challenge those of you who sit with us every year. Think about a topic. Think about something you'd like to work on for next year or year after next. I keep telling Linda Wynn we're going to be here for a while. She keeps saying, we're going to be here for a while. God's not through with you yet. But that we would like to see discussed here. Submit it to us. Also, you look at a list of profiles. You don't have to be a historian to understand and produce the material for a profile. I think it's appropriate to have professional historians and editors work, and on our committee we have those to do that. But think about this. It's not enough to come and sit. Be a part of this local conference. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for indulging me, and thank you for coming to the 32nd Local Conference on African American History and Culture. I do need to make one announcement. Come on, Mr. Bobo. Dr. Victor Simmons, who was scheduled to do the presentation on Aaron Douglas, Dr. Simmons unfortunately cannot join us this morning. But Dr. Simmons will be presenting on Aaron Douglas, the esteemed artist, member of the Harlem Renaissance, and later member of the teaching faculty at Fisk, national treasure. He will be presenting at the annual Pearson Lecture Series. The Pearson Lecture Series is an open series, a publicly invited series on the campus of Fisk University. It's the way that Fisk celebrates African American History Month for the public. The event will take place at 7 o'clock on the 28th. That's the last Thursday of the month. It's an annual event open to the public, no fee and ever. We'd like to invite you all to come out, to come to the campus, to come to the Appleton Room Historic Jubilee Hall, hear Dr. Simmons' presentation, also Professor LaFran Ford, who was a student of Aaron Douglas. There will be a conversation regarding Aaron Douglas, teacher and educator. Please come to our campus and enjoy that with us. Hear our jazz ensemble and meet our new president at that time. I think I would be remiss one other point. There's an excellent profile that I didn't write on metropolitan government, and I'd like to recognize Carol Busey. Dr. Busey, stand up. Nashville historian. I hope we came together on several points, but where we're different, that's fine also. Again, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. You make my job so much easier. As Dr. Mitchell stated, Dr. Victor Simmons is not with us today, but instead we are going to have a conversation on Aaron Douglas. And the individuals that will carry on that mission are Jim Hubler, who is State Museum Curator of Art, I can't read my writing, and Architecture, and Susan Knowles, MTSU Center for Historical Preservation. Would you please welcome those two individuals?
It's good to be with you all this morning. I'm sorry Victor is unable to be with us, but Susan and I are both big fans of Aaron Douglas, so we're going to have a conversation today about him and his career. We had a question for you all, though. Is anyone here who is actually a student of Aaron Douglas? Could you raise your hands? Great, great. So it's so important that Nashville has all of these connections and continuity in it. And Aaron Douglas was such an important artistic leader in our community. We want to celebrate him definitely today. Susan?
Well, I am sorry that Victor Simmons is not here. And most of you know he runs 2 galleries at Fisk, maybe 3 actually, when you consider that in the John Hope and Aurelia Franklin Library, there's not only an upstairs gallery named after Aaron Douglas, but in the downstairs lobby reading area, there are the works of Winold Rice, who was a mentor and teacher to Aaron Douglas in helping him develop his mural style that is so characteristic, and I apologize that we don't have images here, but if you haven't seen the beautiful murals of Douglas's in the administration building, former library at Fisk, take yourselves over there before Victor's lecture so you can see the works in situ, and then you'll have an opportunity to hear him expand on that. And he oversees both those galleries and the Carl Van Vechten Gallery at Fisk University, which is another historic place, and they care for the works of Aaron Douglas, the easel paintings. I wanted to ask if anybody here is fortunate enough to own a work by Aaron Douglas. Good, wonderful. A tremendous legacy and a brilliant modernist. How many saw the big exhibition organized by the University of Kansas that was at the Frisch Center in 2008? They did a remarkable job, and that was a long time coming and way overdue, but it did present Aaron Douglas as an important, he was of critical importance and political importance to the African American community as a whole and the world, but he also was an important American modern artist who was right in step with his period. I want to say thank you to Dr. Mitchell and to Celia Walker, who is here, for working with me on a project right around the centennial of Aaron Douglas's birth. Fisk University mounted, they did a symposium and an exhibition, and they brought back some former students. And we collaborated on a project to produce a CD-ROM that would be a publication to show the context out of which Aaron Douglas's modern art expression arose. And this CD-ROM, I think, is still available. The title of it, and here's the political part, it was called Two Paths to Progress, W.B. Du Bois, Charles S. Johnson, and the New Negro Arts Movement. And what it did is explained in larger context how the works of how Douglas was recruited to come to Fisk 1929-30 to start those murals, really important early work that talks about the journey from Africa to America. But it also talks about the building of this country by African Americans. That's the central message, in my view, of the second part of the mural series. And this CD-ROM is designed to show how Douglas was a part of his time, how the movement was very carefully planned by Du Bois and Charles S. Johnson in order to lay the historical groundwork, not only promoting the creative arts of African Americans as a means of leadership, but also laying the groundwork for the modern civil rights movement. And I wanted just to mention, we've got one here, at least, who studied with Douglas and was mentored by him in that important period before he died in 1979. And when Opal Baker, who was the director of the Fisk University Galleries when they organized the centenary programming, she invited some former students who are important artists now, whose basis for their work was inspired by Douglas. One of them is John Simmons, who's a cinematographer in Los Angeles. He left Fisk and went to UCLA. And he also was really mentored by David Driscoll, who was here. And I don't want to not point out that Driscoll and Douglas, as two forces, Driscoll, a generation younger, really crafted a whole group of young artist leaders. And the other one I wanted to mention, because he also came back to pay tribute, is Terry Adkins, who is in Philadelphia now, also his family actually originally from Nashville. But he grew up in Washington, D.C., but he's a sculptor and a musician and has gone on to do very, very well. And so that political legacy, very directly, in my view. And so others of you who have experiences and might want to chime into this dialogue, Jim and I are kind of winging it here and missing Victor being here, but I hope all of us will be at the Pearson presentation, because that will be an exciting evening. Who will help us a little bit by stepping up and thank you.
Revis.
The next young man named James Miles. James Miles was actually a barber and created his barbershop on Jefferson Street. He was encouraged and invited to come and fulfill his talent by one of his clients, Dr. Walter Miller, who was president of the university at the time. He went on to, he'd been there earlier and worked with Steve Douglas. He was related to David Driscoll, but William Cosby becomes a supporter of David Driscoll. Dr. Bill Cosby becomes a collector of David Driscoll. When you walk the campus And that statue was cast by James Locke, a student of
That's
Aaron
great.
Douglas and
Yeah. Thank you, very important to know, and all of us will look at that beautiful bronze differently, knowing Miles. I've seen some of his smaller, beautiful works, very modern work, and yeah, so.
Douglas, we need to remember, too, was a native Kansan. He was born in Topeka, and so it was very important that it was the Spencer Art Museum in Lawrence, Kansas, that actually organized the touring exhibit on Aaron Douglas. And it was in that exhibit that for the first time I got to see aspects of Negro life, the large painting that he did for the public library up in New York, in which the Schomburg Center in New York City up in Harlem owns today. Douglas, I think, is the most inventive artist to have worked in Tennessee. He definitely came up with his own way of expressing both who he was and the culture that he was living in and the period that he was living in. It's sort of an amalgam of African art and Art Deco. And Fisk is so blessed to have those murals in the old Cravath Library building. They are, I think, the most spectacular public art in Nashville, if not in the entire state of Tennessee. Interestingly, Victor also has a connection with Douglas, sort of indirectly. When Victor came to work at Fisk, he was looking at the Winold Reese studies that are down there in the lobby of the library, and Reese was very interested in a number of different cultures. He went out into the plains and the Rockies and did spectacular paintings of Native Americans. He also visited up in Harlem, and he visited St. Helena Island off the coast of South Carolina and did a number of studies of the peoples that he met in those places. One of the ladies he met in St. Helena, he did a painting of, and Victor told me that as he was coming to work at Fisk and he was looking at these paintings, one of those ladies really struck a chord. She looked so familiar to him. And as he thought about it, he went back and looked in some of the family albums. She was his aunt. So the man who actually taught Aaron Douglas had painted Victor's aunt, and there's that connection here as well. So we're very lucky to have Victor working at Fisk. He loves the collection there. He knows it so well. And it's just interesting, all of these interconnections that we have.
Mm-hmm. But and just thank you all, organizers of the conference, for putting this on this program, because it places visual artists and other creative people in the activist role, and I think that's appropriate, and it's sometimes not always thought about that way, and you see a work of art and you don't have the whole context, and that's where conferences like this are so important, where people who know the history come together, and like what Dr. Mitchell just told us, that story. Now, none of us will ever forget that story. I'm glad I was here this morning to hear it, but we're still, that's the work of historians, to continue to connect those dots and piece those pieces together. So please do, know that any of those kind of anecdotes or anything like that to add into the larger story of artists whose works are collected at the Tennessee State Museum or at Fisk University or at the Tennessee State University's collection. We need to know those things. So.
When I came to work at the State Museum back in 1988, I was first working on the Capitol building and finishing up some of the restoration work on it. But as time went by, Lois also asked me to become the art curator at the State Museum. And I looked at the collection and saw we had a number of large gaps in it, like a whole lot of the 20th century. So I've been trying to plug in artists, and of course Aaron Douglas was one of those artists that I hope to add to the collection. And Gloria and Greg Ridley were good friends, and I had borrowed the portrait. The last actual portrait Douglas did was of Gloria Ridley. I'd borrowed that back in the early 80s when I did an exhibit on Tennessee women at the Parthenon. And Gloria and Greg very generously made that painting available to the State Museum. They didn't want it to go into private hands. They didn't want it to leave Tennessee. They knew that we were always strapped since we're a public institution, so they sold it to us for a very well below market price. Since then, we've also been able to acquire 2 other Douglases recently. I've selected 2 pieces. One is showing a lady musician, and that struck a chord, no pun intended. She represented to me the old history of Jefferson Street, when such great people as Ella Fitzgerald and later Jimi Hendrix would perform there in the clubs along Jefferson Street. Aaron Douglas would have been familiar with those places. Also, there was a lovely watercolor he had done when he went to Nigeria, to Accra. Or to Lagos, rather, and it spoke to me about his connections with his past and wanting to go back as Africa was awakening. Remember, the Prime Minister of England at that time, Douglas Macmillan, spoke about how winds of change were moving across the African continent and a new freedom was being born there. Douglas went there to experience that right before Nigeria gained its independence, so I wanted that piece for the collection. We have a very important collection of your art. We are the public art museum in Nashville. And Gloria has celebrated that with us through the estate of her husband, and Greg did too. She has donated Aaron Douglas's actual easel to the State Museum collection. So that last painting he did and the easel, he did it on our people own now. It's at the State Museum. Greg was also a student of Aaron Douglas, a great admirer of his, and we own a lot of Greg's pieces as well. He was a good friend of mine and of the museum.
And I'm very glad you mentioned Greg Ridley, because he too is a direct legacy. His contact with Douglas, even though he worked in a very different style, he also very much wanted to tell important stories. I mean, his goal was for people to know history and to have it expressed in a forceful way. And our public library here, as you all know, in the Grand Reading Room, has a whole cycle of his copper repoussé, low relief, that again tell a sweeping story. And so there's a nice parallel between the murals at Fisk and the copper repoussé murals of Greg Ridley. Thank you for mentioning that. Very important key player, both at Tennessee State University for many, many years, and then at Fisk University in his later years. So it's nice to be here and remember and talk about those who have led the way here. Anybody else have a story they'd like to tell, or something they'd like to bring up, a question they'd like to ask of someone here? Yes, Linda. Come up here, because
There is another connection with Greg Ridley. Greg Ridley used to be a member of the planning committee for this conference. Also, as a personal note, Greg and I shared the same birthday month. And every year in July, I could always expect a nice little repoussé, usually in copper, from Greg around my birthday. He and I were great friends. And I really, really miss Greg around the campus, because he and I would end class about the same time in the afternoon or really evening. And we would stand out, especially if it was the spring, and just have very long conversations about a number of things. So I really miss Greg. He was not only an artist, but as you said, Susan, he always wanted the story told. I remember when he was doing the repoussé for the library, he gathered a committee of historians. Dr. Mitchell served on it. I was a part of it.
I was too.
Carol Kaplan, I think.
Kaplan, Dr. Lovett, to tell that Civil War story. And he wanted to make sure that we had it right. And he said, now, Lynn, Sister Lynn, you sure that's right now? Because I want to be right. So it was really an honor and a pleasure to work with him and to bring the two disciplines together as we attempted to make it correct, and he put his vision onto copper.
Greg and I actually shared the same birthday, July 18. So I also got a nice reprise with our birth date on it and the crab sign. Yeah. Greg was always very, very generous, always too generous with his art and sharing it.
Yeah. And again, I'm sure many of us in this room were gifted with a beautiful little piece and have that legacy to remember. But I think it's an important note on which to close this morning, and let's keep this dialogue going. So thank you. Yeah.
Our next presentation is titled "The Proposition That All Are Created Equal, the Emancipation Proclamation." That presentation will be given by Mr. Dan Pomeroy. Dan is from Kingsport, Tennessee. He attended the Citadel as well as the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, where he did master's as well as PhD work, and his dissertation and thesis were on antebellum Southern history. He is currently the curator or director of the Tennessee State Museum in downtown Nashville. Would you please welcome Mr. Pomeroy?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I've got, let's see, pull this out. I hope I can run this without some assistance, but I have assistance right here if I need it. I first of all want to call your attention to Linda Wynn's excellent essay on the Emancipation Proclamation in Tennessee. I hope you picked up a copy. And I also want to mention the exhibition that we are about to open at the Tennessee State Museum on Discovering the Civil War. It's an exhibit from the National Archives, and it will feature the original Emancipation Proclamation. And that original document will be on exhibit for 72 hours, but open to the public between the 12th of February and the 18th of February. And after that, we will have a facsimile on exhibit. We also have, as part of that National Archives display, the original 13th Amendment that abolished slavery throughout the United States. And that original document will be there during the entire run of the exhibit. The exhibit will be open from February through September 1st. It covers about 7,000 square feet. It is an exhaustive amount of material on the Civil War, so be sure to see it. We have also organized a companion exhibit from our collection on the Emancipation Proclamation in Tennessee, and Senator Harper, I might mention that it was recommended to us by a member of the legislature, so we are doing what we can to serve the people of Tennessee. I do want to recognize a number of colleagues here. You've already met Jim Hubler. We have Rob DeHart, Graham Perry, Renee White, and if you have any questions about the exhibit, please be sure to talk to them. I have a number of illustrations here. I've got a lot of material to get through in only 30 minutes, so wish me luck. But virtually all the illustrations here come from the collection of the State Museum. Abraham Lincoln was a very complex individual, as we all know. He was a very clever politician. He was also a man whose positions on public policy evolved. This is a photograph of him right after the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, standing with General McClernand. He meant many different things to different people and at different times. As he said himself once, he says, "I've often been accused of being two-faced." He said, "Take a good look at my face. If I had another one, don't you think I'd use it?" Well, the Emancipation Proclamation is somewhat like that. It means different things to different people at different times. Today, we're going to be looking at one aspect of the Emancipation Proclamation, how it applied to Tennessee. And even that has many facets. We might take a look at the document itself, excerpts from the document itself. On the 1st of January 1863, all people held in bondage within a state designated as in rebellion against the United States will be forever free. And the executive, that means the President of the United States, will determine which state or parts of state is in fact in rebellion. How did he determine to define that? Well, if you were represented in Congress through lawful elections, then you were not in rebellion against the United States. So I, Abraham Lincoln, designate the states or those parts of states that are in rebellion. And if he did not designate your state or your part of state, then the accepted parts are for the present left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. He added between the initial Emancipation Proclamation was issued on the 22nd of July, 1862. Between that time and the one that was finally issued on the 1st of January, 1863, he added this provision, allowing African Americans, freed slaves, to now serve in the armed forces of the United States. And that was a very important difference, and certainly in Tennessee. I think, well, the Emancipation Proclamation is sometimes criticized because it is very much of a legal document. However, I think his ending phrase here takes it far beyond being purely a legal document. I sincerely believe this is believed to be an act of justice warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity, and I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. So this map gives you some idea of where the Emancipation Proclamation applied. Those parts in red, and you'll notice those parts in blue are slave states where the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply. And that includes some counties in Louisiana, areas around Norfolk, Virginia, and whole states. One of those whole states where it did not apply legally was Tennessee. So how is that? How did the whole state of Tennessee come to be excluded, and what, in fact, did that mean? Well, first, let's look at how Tennessee came to be excluded. As the United States progressed towards secession and civil war in 1860 and 1861, South Carolina declared its separation in December 1860, followed by the states south of Tennessee. And as the nation came apart, Tennesseans had to decide whether or not they were going to stay in the Union or leave the Union. Governor Isham Harris, whom you see here, was one of the foremost activists in trying to lead Tennessee into secession. In that regard, we had a public vote in February 1861, thanks in no small part to his efforts, and the people of Tennessee rejected secession by 54%. It is interesting to note that West Tennessee voters, now, of course, voters consisted only of eligible white men in 1861. The voters in West Tennessee voted for secession, Middle Tennessee voted against secession, and East Tennessee voted against secession. But in the intervening weeks and months, events transpired to push Tennessee in a new direction. The Confederate forces, the Confederate government had been formed in February 1861. The Confederate forces surrounded the famous Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. It was garrisoned by a small band, really, of United States troops, and South Carolina was determined to seize this fort. Right now, it was a symbol that the United States government still existed in South Carolina. President Abraham Lincoln, who had been inaugurated in March, decided to resupply the Fort Sumter. So before those supplies could arrive on April the 12th, 1861, the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter and it surrendered the very next day. Abraham Lincoln sent a call out to the country asking for 75,000 troops to put down the rebellion. And Tennessee was one of those states requested, Tennessee still a part of the Union, was one of those states requested to provide troops to the United States government to put down the rebellion. Governor Harris sent a famous reply to the Secretary of War. Tennessee will not furnish a single man for purposes of coercion, but 50,000 if necessary for the defense of our rights and those of our Southern brothers. Tennessee began to tack towards secession. Troops were raised and armed, and Tennessee entered into a military alliance with the Confederacy, even though Tennessee had not yet seceded. This is a flag from Lebanon, Tennessee, put together by the women of Lebanon, urging the men to go and fight. It's one of the flags in our collection. I might mention that we've imposed these colors over it. All the reds and the blues have pretty well faded from the flag presently. But it is an indication of the war fever that swept Tennessee. So another referendum was held in June, and Tennesseans voted to secede. The critical difference here is that Middle Tennessee switched its vote from fidelity to the Union and voted to secede. East Tennesseans still voted against secession and were very much committed towards staying in the Union. Well, it was impossible, virtually impossible, to remain neutral. Tennesseans had to take sides. This is an example of somebody who had to take sides. Alexander P. Stewart was from East Tennessee, Hawkins County, Rogersville. He had graduated from West Point in 1842. He was an academician. In 1861, he was a professor of philosophy and mathematics at Cumberland College, right over here in Lebanon, where those ladies were putting that flag together. I'm not aware that he supported slavery, but he did decide to go with his native state, and he ended up joining the Confederate Army and rose to lieutenant general, one of the highest ranking officers in the Confederate Army. After the war, he ended up going back teaching at Cumberland, and he ended up being chancellor of the University of Mississippi. But he's an example of somebody who was torn. He had allegiance to the Union. He was against secession, but he chose to go with his native state. Other people had to make decisions. One of them was Andrew Johnson, who was United States Senator from Tennessee, and William G. Brownlow. Both of these individuals end up playing a very important part in the affairs of the Emancipation Proclamation in Tennessee. So let's say something more about them. Andrew Johnson had been governor of Tennessee in the late 1850s before becoming senator in 1857. He was from Greenville. He was a self-made man. He was a tailor, had taught himself to read and to write. He was an advocate of the working class. And by that, by an extension of that, he did not think much of the planter aristocracy and the system of slavery, though he himself owned a few slaves. He was very class conscious, and he carried that on his shoulder. When Tennessee seceded, Andrew Johnson refused to leave the Senate, refused to follow his state. He was not able to return to his home in Greene County until well after the Civil War. Another individual is William G. Brownlow, a Whig, a man who disliked a lot of things and was not reluctant to say so. Among the things he disliked were Presbyterians, Roman Catholics, and Democrats. And he didn't like abolitionists. He was very much in favor of slavery. He was an East Tennessee Methodist minister and newspaper editor. In fact, he traveled around as a pro-slavery advocate in the years just before the Civil War. When Uncle Tom's Cabin came out, he said that Harriet Beecher Stowe is a deliberate liar and ugly as original sin. He loved to attack people personally. But he also supported the Union. He was very much against secession. And this is a perfect example of these conflicting motives that people had at the time. He said, "I am for the Union," and that very simple statement was the most important thing in his life. He would become, we'll talk further about this, he would become a martyr to the Union as an East Tennessean and would become governor of Tennessee in 1865 and would be governor and then United States Senator during the years of Reconstruction. The Confederates occupied, I think that's an accurate phrase, occupied East Tennessee, since most of the folks there were against secession, in 1861. They allowed Parson Brownlow, that was his nickname, Parson Brownlow, to continue publishing his newspaper, which castigated the Confederates. They finally arrested him, and so he became very much in the North a martyr to the Union. They released him and allowed him to go into the Union lines, and he began to tour the North, preaching politically preaching against secession and against the Confederates and in favor of the Union, and became very much a hero in the North. This little dime novel book is typical of the sort of propaganda that existed about Parson Brownlow. Well, events transpired to change things dramatically in Tennessee. As we all know, in February 1862, under the command of Ulysses Grant, Union forces and Union naval forces captured Forts Henry and Fort Donelson. And by those captures, the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River were opened as avenues of invasion and occupation for the Union Army. This is something of a fanciful illustration, but it shows how Grant was viewed. That's Grant in the far left corner there. I suspect Fort Donelson battle didn't occur exactly like this, but it was a great propaganda piece for the time. So a good bit of Middle Tennessee, West Tennessee was now almost immediately occupied by the Union forces. Andrew Foote, who commanded the naval forces, sent this broadside to the citizens of Clarksville, assuring them that they had nothing to worry about. And in particular, notice that he says, they do not need to be concerned, neither in the persons nor in their property shall they suffer molestation by me. Now, their property also meant slaves. And this was an assurance that slavery would not be interfered with in early 1862. Well, Nashville, the state capital, could not be defended. Union gunboats coming down the Cumberland River, and it surrendered on the 25th of February, 1862. This is a sketch showing the Union troops there on that day, the Guthrie Grays, and William Driver's flag, Old Glory, is being flown from the Capitol, but that's a whole nother story. I will say William Driver, and you're familiar with William Driver, a sea captain from New England, is another example of the divided allegiances. He was very much committed to the Union. One of his sons died at the Battle of Perryville fighting for the Confederacy. Well, Tennessee now is without a government. Governor Harris and the government of Tennessee fled to Memphis and then finally had to leave Memphis by June and leave the state. So we didn't have a governor and we didn't have a General Assembly. So Abraham Lincoln appointed our old friend here, Andrew Johnson, as military governor of Tennessee and also appointed him as a brigadier general. And it was his charge to bring Tennessee back into the Union, though it wasn't clearly defined how that was going to happen. One of the first things Andrew Johnson did was issue this broadside to the people of Tennessee. And you probably can't read it here, but I can assure you that it says he will reestablish the federal authority and that there is no desire of overthrowing or interfering with the rights or established institutions. That, of course, would include the institution of slavery. All of that would change. It would change by the force of events, and it would change to a great extent by the agency of African Americans. They began to flee to the Union lines, where they thought, rightfully, that they could secure freedom. And so the Union was forced with a daunting question. How are they going to define these African Americans who are entering their lines? They had been ordered to have a policy of exclusion. No African Americans will be allowed within the Union lines. That was a formal directive and order. Of course, it couldn't be done. They were being overwhelmed by African Americans who were seeking their liberty and seeking their freedom. This is a soldier sketch of Fort Negley. My friend and colleague Bobby Lovett has written extensively on this, and I recommend you read what he has written, but it is one of the largest, most impregnable bastions ever built by the Union Army, and it's right here in Nashville. Visit it. And it was built largely with African American labor. It is a symbol of how the Union Army then began to use African Americans to support the Union war effort. In this sketch, you can see an African American up on the ramparts and then one working in the camp here with the Union lines, within the Union lines. They came up with a concept of classifying African Americans as contrabands. Are they slaves? Are they not slaves? Well, they're contrabands of war. They are property taken from pro-Confederates. And they began to set up contraband camps. This is one near Deckard, Tennessee. This is from a northern newspaper in November 1862. So very quickly, African Americans are being organized in ways to support the Union cause. Now, I don't wish to suggest here that the Union Army were all that magnanimous and these camps were wonderful places. African Americans were facing a lot of challenges, even from and within the Union Army. Congress had given some directive through two confiscation acts. One in March 1862 authorized the seizure of slaves if they were being used by Confederates for military purposes. They could be seized, but they could not be freed. The second Confiscation Act in July 1862 authorized the Union Army to seize slaves and also free them. So slavery is really falling apart. Union commanders had to make their own decisions on what to do about slavery and how to deal with it. William T. Sherman, shown here in a photograph taken in Memphis, was one of the individuals who had to decide what to do. He is arguably no friend of abolition, no friend of the slave, but in October 1862, he ordered the police in Memphis that all African Americans were to be treated as if they are freed. That was quite a step. So that's the context of the original draft of the Emancipation Proclamation in September 1862. Slavery is already coming apart. Lincoln issues his draft of the Emancipation Proclamation, and he knew it would be greeted with consternation on the part of a number of people, particularly Unionists. The Unionists of Western Virginia became the state of West Virginia in 1863. The slave states in Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland, and Tennessee. And this was one of the reasons he was so careful and cagey in terms of politics on what the Emancipation Proclamation said. Well, one of the foremost Unionists in Tennessee is Thomas A.R. Nelson, whom you see here. He was in East Tennessee, a Unionist in East Tennessee, occupied by the Confederates. He was so upset by the Emancipation Proclamation that he published a diatribe against it, a broadside, and the Confederates were more than happy to publish and distribute this for him, where he said that that this was a terrible act of barbarism. He thought that it would encourage and incite slave insurrection and all manner of things. Supposedly, he actually then became a pro-Confederate instead of pro-Union. But it's a perfect example of how intricate the politics were and how different people responded to this. This is a portrait that we have of Abraham Lincoln that was commissioned and purchased by the General Assembly in 1866. Well, Nelson and people like him had taken umbrage, and Abraham Lincoln, in considering that, determined that Tennessee would not be part of the Emancipation Proclamation. Why was that? Well, in particular, he encouraged Andrew Johnson to hold elections and make sure that members of Congress would be there from Tennessee. They desperately tried to have elections in West Tennessee, but that's the same time in December 1862 that Nathan Bedford Forrest had his famous raid. So those elections were disrupted. William Bowen Campbell and some other pro-Unionists then put together a petition as another tack, signed by 44 Tennesseans. Most importantly, that included Andrew Johnson. And they presented this petition to Abraham Lincoln on the 23rd of December, 1862, asking that Tennessee be excluded from the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, of course, one of the motives there is that a number of these folks were slaveholders, and they wanted to protect their property. Abraham Lincoln received this petition, and he acted on it, and Tennessee was excluded from the Emancipation Proclamation. But that brings us to our second point here. What, in fact, did that mean? If Tennessee is excluded, does that mean the Emancipation Proclamation had no effect in Tennessee? Well, hardly so. This is a print published in 1864 reading the Emancipation Proclamation. And it fairly accurately portrays, even though it was a print published in the North, it fairly accurately portrays what happened within the African American community. They were very much aware of the Emancipation Proclamation, and they acted on it. And Union officials were aware that the Emancipation Proclamation now changed the focus of the American Civil War. They knew that now this was a war against slavery, and they acted on that. They began to like William T. Sherman, they treated African Americans as if they were free. An example of this is the McCamey family of East Tennessee. Willis McCamey was a prosperous, free black farmer in East Tennessee when the Civil War broke out. One of his sons, we don't know which one, ended up serving in the Union Army. You can probably make out he has an 1859 farm book there on the left where he has written, "The time has come to pass that the Negro is free at last." And he wrote this in 1864. In effect, that's what was going on in Tennessee. This is a very important point. Remember that the Emancipation Proclamation authorized the Union Army to enlist African Americans in the armed forces. And in fact, that's exactly what started happening in Tennessee. In 1863, the Union Army set up recruiting offices here in Nashville and in surrounding cities where they had control, specifically to enlist African American soldiers. So they were acting on the Emancipation Proclamation, in fact, as if it applied to Tennessee. This is a 1864 engraving from a northern newspaper showing African American enlistees getting on a train near Murfreesboro. Here, about 1864, is African American troops in a battery in Johnsonville. Johnsonville is due west of here. It was a major supply station that was set up on the Tennessee River, and they were there guarding it. The enlistees included people like Adam Watkins, shown here with his wife, Hannah. This is a recent acquisition by the museum and one of the most wonderful things we've recently acquired. Adam Watkins was a slave who left the plantation, and he joined the 16th Regiment, United States Colored Troops, in Clarksville. That regiment fought courageously here at the Battle of Nashville in December 1864. He and his wife, Hannah, after the war, moved to southern Illinois. It's a perfect example of what, in fact, was going on in the wake of the Emancipation Proclamation. It offered a practical end to slavery. Well, in 1864, it was time for Abraham Lincoln to run for re-election. And he chose Andrew Johnson as his vice presidential running mate. It was a perfect political move for Lincoln. Andrew Johnson's a Democrat. Lincoln is a Republican. Andrew Johnson is a Southerner. Abraham Lincoln could demonstrate a reunification of the nation. And they ran on the Union ticket and were successful. So now Abraham Lincoln is going to be leaving Tennessee. That will leave Tennessee again without a governor and without a government. He was delayed somewhat by the Confederate Army of Tennessee re-entering Tennessee, laying siege to Nashville in the Battle of Nashville in mid-December 1864. But after that, the way was clear for him to pack his bags and head on up to Washington. So, how is Tennessee going to be governed now? Well, it was very important to Lincoln, remember, to have elections and to establish government and to demonstrate, this was already the legal position that he had, that Tennessee was part of the Union. Tennessee was not part of the Confederacy. So between our friend Parson Brownlow, who is now back in East Tennessee had been taken by the Union Army in late 1863, and Andrew Johnson, a convention was called to meet here in Nashville, and it met here on January the 8th. It was composed of about 500 delegates, almost all of whom were wearing Union uniforms and were loyal Tennesseans. One of them was Alvin Gillum here, who was from Jackson County, who was a brigadier general in the Union Army. and he was vice chairman of this convention. They met and immediately declared themselves to be a constitutional convention. And among other things, they adopted a series of amendments that abolished slavery in Tennessee and that also removed those parts of the Tennessee Constitution from 1834 that prohibited the General Assembly from abolishing slavery in Tennessee. This is from a book on the Acts of the General Assembly in 1865. They adopted those amendments and then submitted them to the voters of Tennessee. Now, not only were you a white male if you were a voter in this referendum, you were a tried and true Union man. And you weren't just a Union man, you were a Union man that passed muster by Andrew Johnson and William G. Brownlow. By golly, let me tell you, you were a true Union man if they allowed you to vote. So these amendments passed overwhelmingly, 27,684 to 133 on the 22nd of February. 3 days later, military Governor Andrew Johnson declared that these amendments had passed and slavery was ended in the state of Tennessee. The Emancipation Proclamation played a very important role in setting the stage and pushing events to this final occurrence. African Americans, of course, were jubilant. On the 20th of March, 1865, they celebrated the end of slavery by holding what one Union officer described as an immense procession of colored people. They marched through the principal streets of the city, dressed in their best, a parade composed of both sexes and all ages, on foot and riding in carriages, hacks and vehicles of all kinds, with 2 fine brass bands. Business and labor generally was suspended. The African American community, which I should mention, had presented a petition on January the 8th, 1865, to this convention, asking not only that slavery be abolished, but also that they be given civil liberties and the right to vote. They also presented Andrew Johnson with a gold watch, honoring his untiring energy in the cause of freedom. Well, we know today, of course, that there was great disappointment for those who thought that slavery would not only be abolished, but civil and political liberties would also follow in its wake. But that's another story beyond the scope of what we're talking about here today. We know that whatever disappointments there may be beyond 1865, we are here to recognize the significance and the powerful moral authority that the Emancipation Proclamation brought forth from the crucible of war. It may not have legally applied in Tennessee, but it had a profound effect in Tennessee. It was, in Lincoln's words, an act of justice. It would reverberate as an inspiration for social justice for the next 150 years, and it has certainly withstood the considerate judgment of mankind. Thank you. Oops.
Thank you, Dan, for that excellent paper on the Emancipation Proclamation and Tennessee and its impact on African Americans in this volunteer state, as we call it. At this time, I don't see Howard Gentry, who is the criminal court clerk. There may be another engagement that is holding him up at this time. So we will move. we will move forward at this point, and we will ask Senator Harper to come to the center stage, Dr. Mitchell, and Becky Werner. Are you here? At this point, we are going to recognize 3 students from John Early Middle School who wrote essays on the Emancipation Proclamation, and we're going to announce the winners this morning.
Good morning. We are thrilled that you're here, but we, we're recognizing that Mr. Gentry is not here today, and of course I can't do in his place, but just tell you that he's outstanding for Tennessee and for Nashville, and for, as we're going to have our young people come today, thank you.
Good morning. It's very special indeed for me to be able to come back and share in this experience. As a 2002 graduate of Tennessee State, I'm glad to be able to come back and bring some of my students with me to share in this experience. I charged some of my students to be able to explain and articulate the effects of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil Rights Movement on the Nashville community as well as Tennessee as a whole. So based upon the presentation we just heard, I was right on track. I'd like to recognize 3 students who wrote exemplary essays from John Early. These are 8th grade students in my English class. First, I'd like to recognize Nicholas Taylor, who wrote a paper on Nicholas wrote a paper on the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil Rights Movement and its effects on Tennessee. I'd also like to recognize Sidney Clendenning. Sidney's paper was entitled The Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil Rights Movement's Effect on Nashville. And finally, I'd like to recognize McKenna Morgan. McKenna's paper was also entitled The Emancipation Proclamation and its impact, the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil Rights Movement and its impact on the city of Nashville. I'd like to recognize all the students who participated because we kind of had to pull double duty. We had the TCAP writing assessment for 8th grade online this week, so they had to do their research and write their papers on their own time outside of school. So I'd like to recognize them for that as well. Hopefully, we're trying this out as a test. Hopefully, our students who participate in this writing experience will be able to participate and present here. So hopefully, we'll be able to get that going next year. Thank you.
It is my pleasure to introduce Ophelia Payne. She is a native Nashvilleian. She holds undergraduate and graduate degrees from Emory and Vanderbilt universities. She has worked as a writer, editor, and public programs coordinator for the Metropolitan Historical Commission of Nashville and Davidson County. She has successfully written grants for various historical projects. Among those included would be Andrew Jackson Slept Here, a guide to historical markers in Nashville and Davidson County. Look and See the Town, a guide to historical sites in Nashville and Davidson County and the African American historical sites in Davidson County. She also serves as a member of the planning committee for this conference, and she serves on the boards of the Tennessee Historical Society, Humanities Tennessee, and the Ladies Hermitage Association and the Tennessee Historical Commission. Ophelia Payne. Along with her is Katie Randalls. She holds a BA in History from the University of Alabama in Birmingham and an MA in Historical Preservation from the Middle Tennessee State University. She was a research assistant at MTSU Center for Historical Preservation for 2 years before joining the Land Trust for Tennessee's Glenlaven Farm as outreach and educational coordinator. Her research includes 20th century American history, women's history, African American history, and a study of historical landscapes. Welcome.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting us to speak today. Serving on the planning committee of the African American Culture and History Conference was one of the most enlightening and rewarding and fun parts of my job at the Metro Historical Commission, and I am really delighted to be back here today. Today I'm here as a volunteer for the Land Trust for Tennessee's Glenlaven Farm. Glenlaven, for those of you who don't know it, is just 4 miles from downtown Nashville, about 10 minutes from here. And it was owned by the Thompson family from the 1780s until 2006 when it was given to the Land Trust for Tennessee. Katie is going to present the results of our research thus far into the African American community of Glenlaven. As was just said, she has a master's degree in historic preservation for MTSU, and most significantly, she worked on a historic structure report on Glenlaven, and she and I, along with the help of Jessica French, a PhD candidate at the center, are working to uncover the history of the African American community at Glenlaven, and we have begun gathering some stories. And as Revis Mitchell said so wonderfully this morning, we want to gather it. We're about gathering stories. We've just begun, and we want to gather more. We also want to thank the Tennessee Civil War and National Heritage Area for a grant supporting this project. And we want to thank Dr. Revis Mitchell, Professor Linda Wynn, and Dr. Bobby Lovett, who have generously shared their time and their knowledge and our suggestions in pointing us to sources to get more information. So thank you. Katie?
Thank you, Ophelia. And good afternoon. Thank you again for having us speak to you today. As Ophelia mentioned, Glenlaven is a 65-acre working farm located just a few miles away from here on Franklin Pike. It has a historic house that was built in 1857. It's Greek Revival in style, and most likely built by the slaves on the plantation. We also have several outbuildings. These are two of them, just the smokehouse and the farm office, both also built in 1857. And we have several acres of farmland. We have a local farmer from Dixon County who grazes heritage breed beef cattle, and the Hermitage Hotel maintains a 2-acre vegetable garden. As Ophelia said, Glen Levin was the home of the Thompson family from 1780 until 2006, when Susan West, a Thompson descendant, left it in her will to the Land Trust for Tennessee. The Land Trust's mission is to preserve Tennessee's natural and historic landscapes for future generations. And this was something Susan was really interested in. She wanted this land to be protected forever and had fought hard in her life to keep it that way. And thanks now to her generosity and foresight, the land can never be subdivided or developed. Glen Levin is also part of what was originally a 647-acre land grant given to Thomas Thompson for his service in the Revolutionary War. Thompson was a pioneer from North Carolina, an early settler of Nashville, one of the earliest, and a signer of the Cumberland Compact. When he died in 1837, he left his estate to his son, John Thompson. Here's a portrait of him in the Colonial Dames Project. The portrait is by Washington Cooper. And John worked hard to grow his father's estate, reaching nearly 1,000 acres by 1850. So this was quite a sizable plantation. The slave census of 1850 tells us that there were at least 60 slaves living at Glen Levin in 1850. And when I worked on the historic structure report on Glen Levin, we looked at Donald Winter's study on Tennessee farming, and he found that Tennessee farmers, only 5% owned more than 20 slaves at this time. Fewer still owned more than 50, positioning John among the elite planter class. Recent brick and mortar analysis confirmed that the bricks used to build the home at Glen Levin were handmade on site, likely by Thompson slaves. But for this and the sheer number of enslaved African Americans living at Glen Levin in 1850, we know little about who these people were. No cemetery has yet been identified. No slave housing is extant on the property today. And though we have ideas and educated guesses about where these might have been, we don't know for sure. What we do know of the African American community at Glen Levin comes mostly from personal letters, John Thompson's account books, census data, and newspapers. Probably the most exciting document that we've come across so far, let me go back, is this account book that John Thompson kept. And we're not exactly sure when he first began recording births, but probably sometime in the 1820s when he took over the farm. And we know that he was a meticulous record keeper, keeping record of every birth and death from then up until 1862, when we believe he was imprisoned as a prisoner of war during the Civil War. These records yield not only names of Thompson slaves, but where known, who parented which child. We also occasionally see where John struck through a name, as you can see in this excerpt, and noted a death date. Using this information, we've since been able to loosely construct some idea of families at Glen Levin, and have been able to use birth dates in this record to match these people with names and ages in other records. For instance, we've cross-referenced this list with Union employment rolls concerning the construction of Fort Negley and with list of the United States colored troops, particularly units that formed in Nashville. Though not definitive, considering the proximity of Glen Levin to Fort Negley, it's likely that some of Thompson's slaves would have been impressed into service there. While several of the names listed as belonging to a J. Thompson in the Fort Negley construction records are quite common, some are not, such as Altamont, Fall, and Green. In total, there are 16 men between the ages of 15 and 41 years old listed in the Fort Negley construction records, whose names also appear in John Thompson's account book, and could have been from Glen Levin. Cross-referencing these lists with USCT regiments, there are a few names that appear in both as members of the 12th USCT. Dr. Bobby Levitt says that the 12th was organized in Nashville in 1863, consisting mostly of men from Nashville's contraband camps and from the Army's engineering department. He says that most Company G soldiers were former laborers who had built Fort Negley. Now, there are 3 Thompson names on the Fort Negley employment rolls that can also be found in the 12th USCT: Henry, Paul, and Simon. Though Henry was a member of Company K, not G, his muster papers reveal that he was born in Davidson County and was 35 years old in 1863. Compared to the list of births we have, there was a man named Henry born at Glenlevin to Joseph and Mima in 1827, making him 35 in 1863. It's possible this is the same man. Now, actually, as I was pulling this research together for this talk today, and I was looking at these three men again and looking at the birth records again, I actually think that at least Henry and Paul, if not Henry, Paul, and Simon, all were brothers. I think Henry and Paul were both born to Joseph and Mima, and there was a Simon born to Joseph and Mima who would be their younger brother. But his muster paper doesn't give his age, so I'm not able to confirm that with his birth date. So Paul and Simon, who also appear on both lists, they were a part of Company G, therefore more likely to have been at Fort Negley. Dr. Levitt says the 12th guarded sections of the Northwest Railroad near Kingston Springs and performed duties at Nashville's military hospitals before joining other local USCT regiments to exhume the bodies of soldiers from the battlefields and bury them in the National Cemetery in Madison between 1865 and 1866. It is likely based on these findings that at least a few of Thompson's slaves were members of the USCT, if not more. We know the house at Glenlevin was used as a Union field hospital following the Battle of Nashville in December 1864. Thompson's property was literally between the battle lines and saw encampments from both sides. Based on a medical director's report, we believe there may have been more than 450 soldiers treated there, mostly Union, at least 50 of them African American. Most of the wounded were members of the 13th USCT, which also formed in Nashville, and 2 were members of the 12th, though we don't know their names. A newspaper article from a Confederate Veterans Reunion in 1907 says the family prepared, quote, the loom house, and we're not exactly sure which structure this was, but that they had prepared the loom house for wounded African Americans and the home for white soldiers. But there were so many wounded USCT at the Battle of Nashville, eventually both black and white soldiers filled the Thompson home. Surgeries were performed in the home's parlor on the family's rosewood piano. And John Thompson's wife, Mary Hamilton Howes Thompson, was impressed to assist with the surgeries and helped care for the wounded. This is a picture of her about 10 years before the war. Family accounts say that her hair literally turned white during the war, and so the pictures we have of her, just on the other side, she looks to have aged quite a bit. Most men were likely treated and moved to a general hospital within the first day. Some might have stayed until they were well enough to be moved, but many more died and were buried somewhere on Thompson's property. We know from federal records that at least 90 bodies were exhumed and reinterred to the National Cemetery in 1866. At least a third of them were USCT. We're still doing research to learn who these men were, but knowing what we do of the 12th USCT Company G, some of the men who worked to exhume the bodies might have been formerly enslaved African Americans from Glenlevin themselves. So, what was life like as an enslaved African American at Glenlevin? Well, we have mixed reports, and frankly, we don't have a whole lot to go on. In 1822, the overseer of John Overton of neighboring Travelers Rest came to Glenlevin to complain that some Thompson slaves had stolen apples from Overton's orchard. John Thompson was not home at the time, but we have a letter he wrote to Judge Overton in response. Thompson would have been 22 years old, and Overton would have been a successful judge in his 50s by this point. Thompson wrote that he discovered who stole the apples and whipped them, adding, quote, "If you wish them whipped again, you are entirely welcome to have it done by yourself or your overseer. They promise me very fair that they will never steal anymore," end quote. 20 years later, we see this patriarchal tone continue, but in a more mellow way. 3 letters from John Thompson to wife Martha Dunn Rawlings in the 1840s describe different aspects of life on Thompson's plantation. Here, Thompson refers to the slaves as, quote, the family, saying, quote, "Our family has not been well since you left. Matt got his back hurt at market about 10 days ago. He is still laid up, and when he will get up, I can't say. Not much better. Doctor is sick and has been for a week. Fever seems to be slow. Was a little better yesterday, but worse today. Little Daniel is sick for the last 3 days. Fever, pulse, worms. I'm giving all the attention to them I can and shall trust the All-Wise for the balance. Joe is just as you left him. I asked if he could go to market. He said he was not able. I have sent Joe Banks. He is doing tolerable well." Perhaps the family refers to all of Thompson's slaves, or maybe only to those who lived in the house. Thompson's attention to health of his slaves is confirmed by the ledger of John R. Wilson, a doctor who visited Thompson's plantation on several occasions in 1843, mostly caring for a tubercular daughter of John's. You can see here he came for Miss Mary to prescribe medicine and treatment, and then it'll say Miss Mary and a Negro girl, Miss Mary, 2 Negroes. We see these names referenced in the letters, and we see them again in John Thompson's account books. We have a list of first names and what appear to be shoe sizes written on a single sheet of paper tucked inside one of his ledgers. This was probably recorded for a large shoe order, we guess, but perhaps it was kept, as it was common to describe runaways in newspaper notices by their height, weight, and shoe size, and that is something that we've seen in newspaper notices concerning John Thompson's slaves. Though we'll continue to research this part of Glenleven's history, we may never know the full story of pre-war life at Glenleven. But of the more than 60 African Americans who lived at Glenleven before the war, when we started this project, we really didn't know very much about where they went after emancipation or how quickly or slowly they left. With the war over and slavery legally abolished, some formerly enslaved African Americans headed north. Others trained in specific trades might have found work in the city, while some returned, if reluctantly, to the large plantations of the South to find work as tenant farmers and house servants. We recently uncovered information about some of the formerly enslaved who lived and worked at Glenleven and where they went in post-war years. There were 2 men, roughly 5 years apart in age, named Simon Thompson, listed on John Thompson's ledger. Apparently both worked at Fort Negley, and one joined the 12th USCT, but left Nashville sick and never returned. It's possible he died then, but because he never reported for duty, he was marked a deserter just 1 month from his mustering. There is also a Simon Thompson listed in the 1875 city directory as a blacksmith, and we know that John Thompson ran, from what we can tell, a pretty large blacksmith shop just south of the home at Glenleven on Franklin Pike. So perhaps he was trained there. Unfortunately, we don't know more about these 2 men, and we don't know which joined the USCT or which was the blacksmith. But one of the more fascinating stories we have of post-emancipation years comes from a newspaper article in 1866 depicting a wrestling match between, quote, "a white man named Uzziel Prickett, the reputed champion of the United States, and Simon Thompson, raised by Mr. John Thompson a few miles from the city," end quote. The article said the crowd seemed to have confidence in the white man, and the betting was all one-sided. Apparently, the match ended in a huge upset because Simon won. Only one family appears to have stayed or returned to Glenleven by the 1870 census. Jack and Leah Sanger, or Sawyer as it is sometimes transcribed, and 4 generations of their family are living at Glenleven. Jack and Leah were born in Maryland and would have been close in age with John Thompson, possibly some of his first slaves. But their 46-year-old daughter, Hannah, Hannah's 21-year-old daughter, Pauline, and most likely Pauline's oldest child, Willie, were all born into slavery at Glenleven. In 1870, their occupations are listed farmhand or house servant. Pauline is living in a separate structure on the property with her family, a husband named Harvey, their 2 children, and a woman named Patsy Sykes, a 60-year-old woman born in Mississippi. Harvey nor Patsy are in Thompson's ledger and do not appear to have been enslaved at Glenleven. Also in the census, there is a young man named William Thompson living nearby, if not on Thompson property. His occupation is listed common labor, and based on his age and a William in Thompson's ledger, he appears to have been born into slavery at Glenleven to parents Betty and Henry. By 1880, all of Leah and Jack's family are gone from Glenleven, and so is William. There are several African Americans living and working there as house servants and farm laborers, but none of their names match those on Thompson's ledger. There are several Hadleys, likely connected to the Hadley plantation, and one family of Browns. We've searched for members of Leah and Jack's family in the census and city directories, but haven't been able to locate them yet. The last record we have of them is a receipt between Mary Hamilton and Leah made sometime in the 1870s. It appears that Leah gave a sum of money to Mary to keep for her benefit, and that Mary returned the money to her. It's tempting to think that this is the moment that Leah left Glenlevin. The receipt has a line there for, it says her mark, and you see where Leah made an X, suggesting that she was illiterate. And interestingly, she's called Leah Thompson here. The 1900 census records again show a few Hadleys, a family named Lee, and possibly some Hardings. Again, none of the people listed here appear to have been enslaved at Glenlevin. We're still conducting research on these families to determine where they came from and who they were. In 1905, the Nashville Banner printed stories on 2 former Thompson slaves. One article reads, "Former slave comes home. Prominent Nashville banker has interesting visitor." It described a man named Clem Thompson, then a Baptist preacher, going to visit John Thompson's son, Joseph, whom he had not seen since Joseph was a boy. The article said that Clem left Glenlevin in 1862, right at the start of federal occupation in Nashville, and went first to Illinois, where he lived for several years before settling in Kansas. Another Banner article entitled "The Faces We Meet on the Crowded Street" profiled a man called Granddaddy Thompson, who was born into slavery at Glenlevin and in 1905 lived behind a grocery store off Woodland Street in East Nashville. He was a wood hauler and was known for using a wagon and a team of 4 dogs to haul wood. When asked where he was born, he replied, "I was born on the Franklin Road, and I lived here all my life, except when I was traveling with the dogs." He apparently traveled around the area with the dogs and appeared in parades. The last person I want to mention appears in the 1900 census, living at Glenlevin, and is someone we know much more about. Her name was Tommy Ella May. May was born into slavery to the May family in Tryon, Tennessee, near Brentwood, in 1850, before coming to work for the May Overton families of Travelers Rest. After the Civil War, she traveled with an Army doctor's family to San Francisco, where she worked and learned to speak some Chinese. She worked briefly in Kansas and lived for a short time in Salt Lake City with her sister before returning to Middle Tennessee sometime in the 1880s. Here she worked for the Thompsons at Glenlevin, helping Mary McConnell Overton Thompson with her many young children. Though census records stated she was illiterate, family papers suggest that she taught all of the children in the Overton, Thompson, and Orr families to read, and Harriet Davis Orr, May's last charge, said that May even taught her to count in Chinese. Orr wrote a paper about her memories of May in 1979, saying that May was a longtime member of Holy Trinity Episcopal, and that once Mary McConnell Overton's children were grown, May moved in next door with the Orr family, who she worked for until her death in 1949 at the age of 99 years old. We think this photograph was taken somewhere near the end of her life. African Americans continued to play an integral role at Glenlevin throughout the 20th century. Our research has only taken us to the turn of the century so far, but we know that there were African Americans who lived and worked the farm all the way up until Susan West moved into the house in the 1990s. In fact, for the first 20 years that Susan owned Glenlevin, an African American family lived in the house as caretakers. While we have learned so much about the African American community at Glenlevin in just a few short months, we know there is much more to learn. Where did Leah and Jack's family go when they left? Who was Simon Thompson? What about the other 50 or so? Who were they? Where did they attend church? Where did they go after emancipation, and how quickly? Are their descendants still living in the area? What are their stories? It is our hope that by sharing this information as much as we can with members of Nashville's African American community and historians, new leads will surface and maybe some of our questions will be answered. Thank you again for inviting us to speak today. We hope you will contact us if you have any information to add to our research.
Thank you for that very informative presentation. Next on our agenda for this afternoon is a presentation by Dr. Stacy Graham, the Plantation Community Cemetery, Antebellum Blacks and Whites and the World They Made. Forgive me, Lord. Okay. Speak softly. Dr. Graham received her BA from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and her MA PhD in history from the University of California in Los Angeles. As a research professor, Dr. Graham provides research and writing supports on exhibits, projects, and the National Register nominations, and also teaches courses at MTSU, Department of History. Graham is also the project coordinator for Teaching with Primary Sources across Tennessee, a program for the Library of Congress which promotes educators' use of digital primary sources in the classroom. We give a warm welcome to Dr. Stacy Graham.
Thank you very much. And thanks for staying with us to the end today. And I want to thank the committee for inviting me to speak. It's an honor to be here. And I'm just going to change the PowerPoint if I can. Okay, I can't see anything on this screen down here, so if anybody knows how to help me, that would be great. Okay. What you see in this picture is the final resting place for generations of Buckleys. Along the edge of a cotton field in rural Henderson County, Tennessee, the Buckley Cemetery is part of the 19th century landscape of the Buckley Plantation, founded circa 1840. What appears at first glance to be a private cemetery for the White Buckley family, upon closer examination is a more complicated space. To the north of the family tombstones, across a length of open space is another grouping of burials with less prominent grave markers and additional family names. These date largely to the 20th century, some of them contemporary to the more recent graves that are in the southern part. The open space separating these two sections of the cemetery reveals soil depressions and undulating earth that is indicative of unmarked burials. So who then is buried in the Buckley Cemetery? The answer goes beyond the white plantation owner's family and their descendants, although they certainly are there. Dozens of Buckley's slaves were buried in a section of the cemetery right beside that of the white slaveholders. After emancipation, the free African-American descendants of the enslaved Buckleys chose to establish a new section of the cemetery on the north side. This burial space therefore reflects the community of whites and blacks who lived and worked on this plantation in the mid-19th century, as well as the commitment by both races to maintain the sacred space together into the 20th and 21st centuries. It is a splendid example of what I call a plantation community cemetery. This paper argues that plantation community cemeteries are significant pieces of material culture evidence that can reflect the dynamics of interracial relationships on plantations. Usually considered private family cemeteries dedicated to the memory of the white families who established them, plantation cemeteries can often provide insight into the complex interactions of whole communities of blacks and whites. Due to the nature of slavery, these interactions were often contentious, reminding us that such communities were often fraught with inequality and coercion. However, the sense of place and attachment to the ancestral home that are well encapsulated in burial grounds had just as much positive force for blacks as for whites. The phrase, "the world they made together," which is taken from the title of a 1987 book by cultural historian Meckel Sobel, acknowledges the ability of blacks in the 19th century to impact the people and spaces around them, both above and below ground. Furthermore, the positions of the graves within these burial grounds can reflect community dynamics. The symbolism reflected by burial positions was no accident. The way people are buried can indicate power just as clearly as the way the buildings in a plantation landscape are arranged. Before examining the distribution of black and white graves in plantation cemeteries, however, let's first take a look at the distribution of these cemeteries across the state. As you can see, the distribution of plantation community cemeteries that I have identified across the state reflects Tennessee's unique geographical and agricultural patterns. These are by no means all. In fact, this is probably the tip of the iceberg. These aren't even all the ones that I have identified. These are just the ones that are going to be mentioned in this paper. So there are still hundreds more out there that I don't know about. And if you know about any, then I would welcome talking to you about them. Few properties in Tennessee fit the traditional plantation model of the Atlantic seaboard and the Deep South. Here, plantations tended to have fewer slaves and less acreage, and contributed to the value of land, slaves, and crops, along with smaller scale farms.
It's one of the wireless ones.
Thank you. Like I said, it's the last one of the day. Thanks for staying till the end. Let's see if we can hold together till the end. Okay, so in East Tennessee, the mountainous terrain, of course, made large-scale farming more impracticable, except in the larger river valleys of the Tennessee and the Holston rivers, where Tennessee's earliest plantations were established around the 1780s. From the 1790s, the Cumberland River and the central basin of Middle Tennessee provided a landscape much more suited to plantation development. Within a decade after the Jackson Purchase opened up West Tennessee to white settlement in 1819, this region, the West, especially the southwestern counties near the Mississippi border, became the location of several major plantations and most closely resembled the plantation agriculture of the Deep South. Slaves were brought to Tennessee by the earliest white settlers and were a part of the development of agriculture in the territory from the beginning. The slave population in the state reached 275,719 by 1860, which was nearly a quarter of the overall Tennessee population, even though the majority of Tennessee landowners did not own slaves, and those who did were more likely to live in Middle or West Tennessee. So far, the plantation community cemeteries, again, that I have found and identified seem to fit this pattern of plantation distribution, with more examples located where some of the plantations and the African American populations were the densest. On the eve of the Civil War, white Tennesseans and black slaves had been living and working in close proximity for nearly a century. So what did this community on the plantation look like? Most farms, whether small and without slaves, or plantations with hundreds of slaves, were self-sufficient in that they produced their own foodstuffs and manufactured their own tools and daily necessities. Within these self-contained landscapes, different forms of hierarchy, economic and social, are reflected through the carefully cited layout of the buildings and the spaces around them. The plantation landscape was set up in such a way as to result in almost constant white and black interaction, quote, making it both difficult and unwise to segment the past into separate spheres of black and white, according to archaeologist Larry McKee. Let's look at an example of a plantation landscape. Andrew Jackson's Hermitage, just east of Nashville. First, we have to imagine we're back in the mid-19th century before the visitor center, parking lots, other buildings built during the WPA period. So the big house, the front drive, and the formal gardens formed the formal zone for the white family and its visitors. The big house at this plantation and countless others was the scene of what is called the black-white family system, in which white children were cared for by black mammies, white and black children played together, white masters had children with slave women, and other intimate attachments were formed between the races in the setting of the main plantation living space. Behind the big house, and there, of course, is Andrew Jackson's grave. That I'll mention again later. Behind the big house, slave cabins and other buildings. There's another site of former slave cabin, kitchens, spring house. So all of those formed a zone of work. So you have your formal zone and your zone of work that was crossed constantly by slaves and often by whites. So where the work zones and the formal zones met was a liminal space that included the big house and certain outbuildings and was the scene of much activity and interaction among the plantation's inhabitants. Even an urban slaveholder's domain reveals a similar pattern. This is the McNeil House in Bolivar, Tennessee, in West Tennessee. So you have your formal gardens, your sub-formal gardens, I suppose, and then you have your slave quarters, and kind of in the middle where they all meet, you have your kitchens and well and some other areas. And these are some black mammies. So this is what the second one of those houses looks like, and that's what the slave quarters look like. They're still there. The process of living and working on a plantation made that landscape home to blacks no less than whites. This sense of place may help explain why so many blacks remained on or returned to the old homestead during the tumultuous years of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Some planters may have confused this attachment to place with a personal loyalty to them. This springs from an overtly paternalistic attitude that dominated most planters' relationships with their slaves. This paternalism, while generally common in many facets of Victorian culture, is especially clear in the ritual of deference, which was a symbolic exchange in which slaves were bound to their masters by economic ties of ownership, and masters were bound by their obligation to take care of their slaves. So how does a cemetery illustrate community? The black-white family system on plantations And by the way, I thought it was nice that Katie Randall mentioned some of that taking place at Glen Levin with the idea of family with John Thompson and his slaves. So the black-white family system on plantations clearly represented a hierarchical structure with whites in positions of ultimate power, which could sometimes be undermined by the possibility of close personal relationships between black and white individuals. Burying blacks in the white family cemetery is a natural extension of this family system. The cemetery landscape also provided planters with another canvas on which to draw the lines of social hierarchy. Naturally, the slaveholder controlled the placement of burials on the plantation and thus the ritual space. Through controlling who would be buried where and what the tombstone, if any, would say, whites could continue to control the perception of master-slave relations. The pattern of burial in plantation community cemeteries varies greatly, but for the purposes of this paper, I generally tend to group them into three categories. One is a single or a few blacks buried among whites. The second is a single or a few whites buried among blacks. And the third is a group of blacks and whites buried next to each other. In the case of the first category, some instances of individual black slave burials among the white family may symbolize a genuine affection between individuals of both races. For example, Andrew Jackson's slave Alfred, whom you see here, is the only black buried in the small family cemetery in the garden beside the Hermitage. There's his cabin. He died in 1901, having lived in this cabin on the Hermitage grounds for all his life. And there's a view of the cabin from the big house. When he died, he requested to be buried beside Jackson's tomb. So you can see it there in the foreground of the neoclassical tomb of Jackson. His sense of place and feelings of loyalty to his former master, combined with his pride at this prestigious connection and his role in that relationship, combined to determine his eternal resting place. And that is his epitaph. James Tubb Jr., a colonel in the War of 1812, requested that his slave Caleb be buried at the head of the family section in the Tubb Cemetery in DeKalb County. And he was. Although it's not exactly clear where that grave lies. I searched the cemetery for any sign of depression around the Tubb family, which are the ones on the left, and I could not find one. So it's kind of unclear what they meant at the head of the family section, but that was what was recorded. The John Walker Jones family lies directly beside the big house on what is today the Ames Plantation Complex in Fayette County in West Tennessee. Unmarked graves on two sides. There you see one side, and here's the view along another. Of this cemetery were discovered by ground-penetrating radar and are thought to be the graves of house slaves, since the field slaves were buried near the site of the slave houses 3/4 of a mile away. The Polks, one of the most prominent families of Middle Tennessee, accorded special graves to their favorite slaves. The cemetery of St. John's Episcopal Church in Murray County contains the tombstones of Agnes and Calvin, and no doubt the unmarked graves of several other slaves too. Note that although Calvin was buried in 1913, he was still immortalized as a slave on his epitaph. You can see large swaths of open space with possible grave depressions between the main part of the cemetery where the whites are buried and the back part where Calvin, Agnes, and the rest are buried, which could be indicative of more slave burials. Another branch of the Polk family that settled in Hardeman County in West Tennessee also buried favored slaves near the family. In the Polk Cemetery in Bolivar are 3 tombstones dedicated to slaves or former slaves. 2, the ones on the left, John and Lila, belonged to the McNeil family, who were related to the Polks and whose house you saw earlier, which stands just across the street from this cemetery. They were buried in the early 20th century. The 3rd, Reuben, was the, quote, faithful servant of John H. Bills, a wealthy white planter who was related to the Polks and McNeils and who owned around 100 slaves by the Civil War. And if you want to see Reuben's grave in relation to John Bills, it's way back there. It's that speck in the distance. Bills kept a diary that documents 6 slave burials in addition to Reuben's in this cemetery. Charlotte, a house servant, Emma, the infant daughter of Victoria, a house servant, Sam, Bill's, quote, faithful old servant even after emancipation, Sam's wife, Lucretia, their daughter, Martha, Martha's husband, Willis, and Sam's only son, who died without a name. Later sources name 2 additional slaves buried in this cemetery, Jim, who came to Tennessee with his master Ezekiel Polk, who is the grandfather of James K. Polk, and Rena, another McNeil slave. Many more African Americans are likely buried here. The entire west side of the cemetery is unmarked, except for those graves that I had mentioned earlier. The Polk Cemetery is quite large today, but in the 19th century, it was still considered a family cemetery. In his diary, John Bills records spending days maintaining these grounds along with some of his slaves. Burying certain slaves in this family cemetery clearly indicates the black-white family system at work. By excluding some blacks and including only those who were literally closest to the white family, these cemeteries perpetuate the paternalistic worldview. The placement of permanent tombstones over selected slaves conveyed the message that faithfulness to whites was the most deserving quality a black could have. It also advertises the wealth and generosity of the owner who would extend such an eternal gift to a slave. Conspicuous compassion, in an apt phrase. Often, these graves post-date the end of slavery when faithfulness and loyalty to former masters were tested by new opportunities of freedom. The cemeteries in this category do not usually represent the entire community of blacks and whites who lived on the plantation, singling out individual blacks as they do. However, they do illustrate how the bonds of family broadened beyond the white planter family to include blacks by virtue of the relationships that were forged in the context of plantation life. Another type of plantation community cemetery reflects an opposite arrangement, with individual whites buried among blacks. This is the case with the Lowry Cemetery in Henderson County, which is in West Tennessee. In the foreground on the right-hand side is the oldest tombstone for a black in the county. It was for Rosie, the mistress of Dr. Lowry, who died in 1856. It's also the case with the Breastworks Cemetery in Claiborne County in East Tennessee. That's a modern marker in the middle, by the way, erected to the memory of David Chadwell, a Revolutionary War veteran. This is near the city of Tazewell. It's called Breastworks because the whole cemetery was completely dug up during the Civil War when a Union encampment built a fort there. And the Bailey Cemetery in Wilson County, that grave wall around that tombstone to Jonathan Bailey, who died in 1872. The wall is thought to have been built by his former slaves, who were known to have been skilled in masonry. The Perkins Cemetery in Williamson County, however, tells a different story. Those former ones, reportedly the white planter felt closer to his slaves than to his white family and therefore chose to be buried among his black family. This is a little different. This cemetery presents a striking example of how, in a plantation community, black slaves can far outnumber their white masters, who tend to become isolated from other whites. Nicholas Big B. Perkins, along with his wife and her parents, lie in the center of the cemetery, marked by this fine marble obelisk, and they're surrounded on all sides by circular rings of black slave graves. Big B was among the wealthiest of planters in Williamson County, with over 11,000 acres and over 300 slaves by 1848. The arrangement of this cemetery reflects a clear sense of the superiority of the whites over the sea of anonymous blacks. I find it ironic that the people to whom the white slaveholders are the closest in death were the people to whom they lived the closest in life, and yet were the people from whom they were the furthest in the social hierarchy. Whether dominating their slaves from beyond the grave, singling out the most quote-unquote faithful, or resting eternally with their black families, white slaveholders controlled how the black-white family system on their plantations would be projected onto the cemetery landscape. In contrast to the first two categories I've discussed, a third type of cemetery configuration most fully projects the idea of a community through the inclusion and arrangement of graves. Sometimes blacks, not just the few and favored, are buried in a portion of the cemetery beside that of the whites. This may in fact be the case with the Polk Cemetery in Bolivar. It is certainly common in urban cemeteries in the South as well as the North. The effect may still be segregated, yet the inclusion of a greater proportion of the plantation population, all within the same space, keeps the community at least intact. So this arrangement can be seen in some of these following examples. This is the Moody Cemetery. This is another cemetery on the grounds of the Ames Plantation in Hardeman County. In Fayette County. There are no tombstones left, but you are actually looking to the southeast down a hill, all covered in vinca, and the slaves are thought to be buried on that downslope side. Same here at the Hill Cemetery in Rutherford County. It is on a hill, but the family's name was Hill, so the cemetery is well named. The slaves were buried on this kind of a downward slope, although the cemetery is still used today by the descendants of the blacks that are buried there, and they now bury their family members at the top of the hill, near the White Hill family. In the Connor Cemetery in Knox County, the white family's tombs are marked with tombstones, and the field stones are thought to mark the slaves from the family. And I can actually name three of the slaves, John, Lucinda, and William Henry, because they were all specifically named in the will of family patriarch William Connor. When he died in 1860, he named them in his will and left them sons of money. With emancipation and the end of the Civil War, the power dynamics of black and white social relations underwent many changes, with blacks exercising their freedom to establish their own identities free of whites. Many black families and communities founded their own cemeteries during Reconstruction as a means to strengthen their new identities and also to exercise their ability to order their world through control over the burial of their dead. Tennessee cemeteries containing the graves of masters and slaves also underwent many changes. Many blacks left the plantation and moved to urban areas or different parts of the state or country, leaving the graves of their ancestors behind. Many blacks stayed on the plantation as sharecroppers and continued to be buried beside their ancestors, but they shifted their community focus from the plantation to the church. Some cemeteries were abandoned by blacks and whites both. That's the case with this one, the Cope Cemetery in Warren County. And you can see there a descendant standing where is thought to have been buried the family patriarch. The plantation community cemeteries that have lasted over the years take on new meaning today. In the Evans Cemetery in Henderson County, Blacks were originally buried outside of the fenced-in white plot. When a new fence was erected around the cemetery in the 1990s, the plot was expanded so that all the graves, black and white, are now encircled together. In the Shiloh Cemetery in Warren County, a small dignified monument was placed in recent years to commemorate the African Americans, slave and free, who were buried in a large unmarked section in the middle of the cemetery during the 19th and 20th centuries. Although there's some controversy about this, because I have since spoken to members of the community who do not believe that there are blacks buried in that unmarked portion, but well, I'm not sure whom they believe are buried there. So I'm not sure what the resolution of that would be, but there is disagreement among the community over the commemoration of the unmarked graves here. Back to the Buckley Cemetery, because it's my favorite example. So in the Buckley Cemetery in rural Henderson County, the establishment of a new section for free blacks beside the section for slaves indicates a conscious identification with their enslaved ancestors on the Buckley plantation. Both white and black descendants of the Buckleys continue to gather here, sharing in the cleaning and maintenance. By focusing on the plantation as a community bound by complex and lasting ties, these cemeteries can be sites of social healing for modern generations dealing with the legacies of slavery and racism. I was listening to an audio CD in the car for fun. I had no idea it would be related to my work in any way. It's The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, and if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's nonfiction, and one of the characters is showing the author of the book the family cemetery where Henrietta Lacks is buried in an unmarked grave, and she was a black woman. And he said this, and it was so great, I just had to listen to it over and over until I could write it down. You know, white folks and black folks are all buried on top of each other in here. They're spending eternity in the same place. They must have worked out their problems by now. People have long noted the burial of a slave or a group of slaves among whites in the same cemetery. This paper looks to reformulate this familiarity. Rather than approaching these cemeteries as ones where blacks are buried with whites, I would rather approach them as cemeteries where all the members of a community plantation are buried together. Blacks and whites forged this community by living and working together, and their efforts are forever imprinted in the material culture landscape through the Plantation Community Cemetery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Graham. I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to thank Ms. Randall, because we've moved into an interesting area here. Archaeological and scientific research, so much a part of history, is now a part of this conference, and your work has made it that way. I don't know if they're here, but if Gail Brinkley and Diane Scott are here, I wish they'd wave at me and stand up. All right, stand up, Diane. It's good to see you in here. For 32 years, Diane was always back in the back until she retired. She finally came, and without Gail and Diane, this conference would have never gotten off the ground. It would have never gotten off the ground. Several of us were busy, interested in research and papers, but somebody had to be interested in getting the fund, in keeping the funds that we tried to raise, and carrying out requisitions and ordering menus and luncheons and things like that. And they set a pattern, and we're just going to try to continue it. Thank you for all that you've done. On behalf of the Planning Committee, I'd like to thank all of you for coming, being a part of this conference. We solicit your input. We solicit your ideas. Hopefully, the organizations, we solicit your funds. We may call upon you, but our aim will never be to disrupt the fundraising activities at our institutions. We rely on small contributions to make this work and keep it a community conference. Thank you for coming out. We look forward to seeing you at the 33rd local conference on Nashville's African American history. Thank you very much.